False assumptions. We must never interpret material prosperity as a sign that God is pleased with actions that are out of harmony with His revealed will. Here's Gene to explain.
When Hosea wrote these prophecies, Israel was actually in a state of prosperity. It was a time of economic development. And in the midst of that material prosperity, here's what Hosea had to say from God, a message from God. Israel is a lush vine. It yields fruit for itself. The more his fruit increased, the more he increased the altars. Now think about that. The more God blessed them with material things, the more they took advantage of that, and the more they built altars to false gods. Hosea went on to say, the better his land produced, the better they made the sacred pillars, which was associated, of course, with their idolatry. The sacred pillars, which many times were sexual symbols. And so God is bringing judgment on them in spite of the fact that they have material prosperity. They are taking advantage of that. And you know, the general principle that comes out of this is that material prosperity can breed idolatry very, very quickly, especially if it happens within a cultural system that does not have biblical values. All you need to do is look at the countries that have been freed up from communist domination. You know, where the top people were wealthy, but the average person had nothing. And once democracy came and gave them freedom, economic freedom and capitalism, the ability to compete, one of the greatest problems in those nations today is materialism. They're being driven by materialism, insatiated desire to make money, to have things, because they were starved for so long. But it's part of the natural tendency. And the fact of the matter is that democracy will not really work as it should with the freedom that we have unless you have a set of biblical values to keep that freedom under control. And in our old culture, we're seeing the blight of materialism. It doesn't say that democracy is wrong. It's simply saying that it doesn't work unless you have a biblical value system. It will never work without that. And that's why it has worked so beautifully within our own culture for many years. But in recent years, it has become an incredibly dominated culture of materialism and control. So, there's no perfect place on this earth. I wouldn't exchange the freedom that we've had, but it's part of our vulnerability. And you see that. And you saw it here in Israel. And that's what Hosea is dealing with. In this Old Testament setting, they also not only had prosperity, but they actually were defeating their enemies and expanding their borders. They were increasing their territory. But what happened? It's setting the stage for what God said through Moses was going to happen. The blessings came when they obeyed God. The curses are coming now because they disobeyed God. And we read about the curses in Deuteronomy 28. And this was written just before they were going into the Promised Land. And it was a warning. And so consequently, you know what happened. Because once they got into the Promised Land, they forgot God, they became idolatrous, and the curses came. Well, once again, the curses are coming, this time on the northern kingdom. Here's what happened. Deuteronomy, Moses predicted it. But if you do not obey the Lord your God by carefully following all his commands and statutes I'm giving you today, all these curses will come and overtake you. And that's exactly what is going to happen to Israel, the northern tribe. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. That happened. Your basket and kneading bowl will be cursed. In other words, your prosperity is going to dry up. Your descendants will be cursed, your land's produce, the young of your herds, and the newborn of your flocks. All of that was very basic in terms of their economy. It's going to go away. And it did. And you will be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. Those were the warnings. And Hosea is telling them, warning them. And he's hoping that Judah is watching and listening so it doesn't happen to them. Sadly, it happened to both the northern kingdom and then ultimately to the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was taken into Assyrian captivity, and then subsequently Judah was taken into Babylonian captivity because Judah was watching and they saw what happened, and lo and behold, they went and committed the same sins, even more so than the northern tribes, which is rather ironic in terms of not listening, not watching, not listening to what God is saying. When Jesus came, same thing happened, was happening. And Jesus condemned the greed, and he called some of the richest people who were the leaders in Israel, the spiritual leaders, he called them hypocrites, blind leaders of the blind. And he used an illustration to get the point across, which is an illustration that he could have shared through Hosea. In fact, God is sharing the same basic message through Hosea. And Jesus talked about the rich fool. And here's what God said to this rich fool. You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. Your material possessions are going to mean nothing. And the things you have prepared, that is all of this material stuff that you've been greedy over. This has been your life. You've loved this. Whose will they be once your life is gone? And then Jesus made this point. That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, with that statement, Jesus is implying it's not riches per se. The problem is not being rich towards God with what God has given us. And Jesus was dealing with that. So we have this question, I think, that directly applies to us today. In what way does the parable of the rich fool apply today to some who identify themselves as Christians? Well, first of all, let me have the Apostle Paul answer that question, because Paul addressed that in his first letter to Timothy when he got to what we call chapter 6, beginning with verse 9. And I've simply called this love of money. Now, when you see that word love of money, you need to realize that it's not the problem of money per se, but it's the love of money, and Paul deals with that. Because he says, but those who want to be rich, and there he's dealing with their motivation. Their motivation is the love of money. That's what their motivation is. They want to become rich because their motivation, they love money. And Paul goes on to explain that. But those who want to be rich fall into temptation, a trap, many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge people into ruin and destruction for the love of money. And there, Paul is defining what it means to want to be rich. That's the motivation. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. What is the root? The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and by craving it, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many, many pains. Again, Paul is not condemning money per se. Jesus wasn't. What he was dealing with was our priority and our motivation. In essence, what he's simply saying is, there's nothing wrong with money, but be careful. Because if your motivation is to love it and to get more and more and more because you love it, you're heading for trouble. Because your motivations are wrong. You're vulnerable. And especially as a Christian. Now, it's not wrong to make money, particularly as a Christian businessman. And I don't think it's wrong for a Christian businessman to want to make money, but for another purpose. to build the kingdom of God. It's not wrong for a Christian businessman to pray in his heart with sincerity, Lord, I do want to use the gifts you've given me, the position you've given me, the possibilities you give me, and I'd like to make a lot of money, but I want to make it for one purpose. It's to build your kingdom. Yes, I know you want me to take care of myself, my family, because those who don't take care of their family are worse than unbelievers. But I want to build your kingdom. Now, as a pastor, as a spiritual leader who is supported by those who make money, I don't think it's ever really proper for me and my people like me to have as their motivation within the ministry to make money. Somehow that just doesn't fit the value system that God has called us to. Because that should not be our motivation. But there are those who make money and desire to make money so I can be in the ministry, so others can be in the ministry, so we can support missionaries around the world. But see, the temptation is that once we start making it, is to keep it for ourselves. And Paul's warning against that. He's just simply saying, be careful. Because once that begins to happen, you're going to be tempted. You're going to be tempted to use it in ways that do not glorify God. And of course, that's a principle, and I think that every person who loves Jesus Christ, with that principle in mind, is able to make the right decisions for the glory of God. So here's the principle, I believe, that grows out of this Old Testament scenario. We must never interpret material prosperity as a sign that God is pleased with actions that are out of harmony with His revealed will. And basically, what I'm saying here with this principle is that Israel, because they were prosperous and they were expanding their borders, believed that God was honoring them in spite of their idolatry and in spite of their evil. And the lesson for those of us who perhaps are in business or making money can say, well, I'm making money. God must be pleased with my behavior. But once you look into that behavior, you see dishonesty. You see manipulation. You see control. You see a violation of the will of God. And yet the person goes on, look, I'm making money, therefore God must be pleased. That's exactly what Israel did, and you know what happened. So that's a powerful principle that comes out of this passage, to beware of rationalization when God blesses us with material prosperity.